Imagine getting arrested for sitting in the wrong seat, not because you caused a scene, but because of the color of your blood. That happened, and worse, America called it justice. This isn't ancient history, it's the foundation of inequality we're still standing on. You'll be furious when you hear how far this lie went. New Orleans, 1892. The city was alive with the sound of clinking streetcars and distant jazz notes bleeding out from dimly lit clubs. But beneath the music and the summer haze, something colder thrummed through the streets: segregation, codified and quietly enforced, like the unspoken rules of a dangerous game. It was a Tuesday when Homer Plessy woke up before dawn. He stood in front of the mirror, carefully adjusting his collar. By all appearances, he could have passed for a white man. His skin was light, his features sharp, but one drop of colored blood in his veins was enough to deny him the rights of the majority. In Louisiana, that drop wasn't just biology, it was destiny. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a preacher, he wasn't even someone who sought the spotlight. But that morning, he was walking into history. Across town, members of the Citizens Committee gathered in a small back room, tense but determined. This wasn't a random act of rebellion. It was strategy, deliberate, precise. They needed a case that could go all the way to the top, a case that would crack open the legal shield of the Jim Crow laws. And Homer was their linchpin. He had agreed, not because he sought fame, but because he believed in something bigger than himself, something fragile, flickering, something called dignity. As he walked down to the Press Street station, the streets seemed quieter than usual. Or maybe it was just his heartbeat drowning out the world. He reached the platform, gripped the brass rail of the Whites' only car, and took a long breath. The metal was warm from the sun, but it felt cold in his palm. He stepped inside. The air in the car shifted. A couple of men in bowler hats looked up briefly, then returned to their newspapers. A woman in lace gloves clutched her purse a little tighter. Homer didn't flinch. He found a seat by the window and sat down. To the unknowing eye, he belonged. But that's the cruel trick, isn't it? In a system built on appearances, it was the blood they couldn't see that made him an enemy. He folded his hands in his lap. He'd memorized the plan. He knew what was coming. The conductor would arrive, ask for his ticket, realize what he was, and call the authorities. The man who would report him was part of the committee. It was all arranged, every step choreographed like a stage play. But knowing something doesn't soften the edge of it. He watched the landscape crawl by old oaks draped in Spanish moss, modest houses lining the tracks. He wondered, for a fleeting second, if any of them knew what was about to happen, if they'd care. The door at the end of the car creaked open. Heavy steps echoed down the aisle. Homer stiffened. The conductor appeared, a thick man with a tan uniform and a baton clipped to his belt. He glanced at Homer, took the ticket, then froze. A long, tense pause. "Are you a colored man?" the conductor asked, voice low but direct. Homer nodded. "I am." Another pause, longer this time. The kind of pause that fills a room with judgment and history and violence not yet spoken. "You're in the wrong car." Homer didn't move. "I bought a first-class ticket. I have the right to be here." "No, you don't," the conductor replied. "Not in Louisiana, not with your blood." Homer looked him dead in the eye. "Then do what you came to do." The conductor turned, gestured to the officer already waiting outside. The moment had arrived. As Homer was escorted off the train, the passengers pretended not to watch, but they did, quietly, curiously. Some with scorn, a few, perhaps, with shame. The metal doors slammed behind him. That sound. It wasn't just the closing of a train car. It was the opening of a battle. A battle between a man and a law. Between dignity and division. Between one seat on a train and a system built to keep people like him standing forever. And Homer knew, as the wheels screeched forward without him, the real journey was only just beginning. They had rehearsed every detail, every line, every pause. The Citizens Committee wasn't a rowdy group of rebels. They were strategists, lawyers, activists, businessmen, teachers, men of color, and white allies who understood that real change didn't come from chaos, but from the cracks in the law itself. Their plan? Simple in design, radical in impact. Create a legal challenge so undeniable it would force the courts to answer the question America had spent decades dodging. Can a government built on freedom legalize discrimination? They believed the answer had to be no. But first, they needed a man brave enough to be arrested, brave enough to lose. That man was Homer Plessy. He knew what was at stake when he stepped onto that train car. He knew the arrest was coming. In fact, he'd been promised it would be clean, quiet, quick. He'd be pulled off, booked, bailed out within the hour. The arresting officer had been handpicked a man friendly to the cause, willing to play his part. But plans, no matter how perfect on paper, don't always survive the heat of reality. The moment Homer stepped off the train, he noticed something was off. The officer who grabbed him wasn't the one they had agreed on. This man's grip was tighter. His words were colder. He wasn't reading from a script. Name? The officer barked. Homer Adolph Plessy. Race? Colored. The officer didn't flinch. He yanked Homer forward, leading him across the platform like a criminal on display. People stared. Children pointed. A man muttered, "Serves him right." Homer kept his head high, but inside, his heart was rattling like a loose bolt on steel. The jail was worse than expected. Small, damp, cramped with men who hadn't seen sunlight in days. The friendly officer, the one meant to ensure Homer's comfort, never showed up. Hours passed. No food, no lawyer, no word. What was supposed to be symbolic was quickly becoming traumatic. At around midnight, the iron door clanged open. A voice, sharp, female, echoed through the hallway. "He's not supposed to be here." It was Maria Duff, a legal assistant with the committee. She had come looking for him after hours of silence. What she saw made her chest tighten with rage. Homer, still in his Sunday clothes, sitting on a filthy bench, arms crossed but visibly shaken. "This wasn't the plan," she whispered as she approached him. He offered a tired smile. "Yeah, I gathered." The next morning, committee members scrambled to file for his release. Bail was posted discreetly, and Homer finally walked free after nearly 20 hours in custody. But something had changed. The symbolic act of civil disobedience had left real bruises, both physical and psychological, and not just for Homer. The committee, too, realized just how fragile their control over the system really was. If a friendly officer could be swapped without notice, what else could the state manipulate? How could they trust a system designed to silence them to also deliver justice? Still, they pressed forward. They had no choice. Homer's court date was set for October. The charge, violating the Separate Car Act by sitting in the wrong train car. The penalty, a small fine. But for the committee, it was never about the fine. It was about the principle. The courtroom was packed. A sea of hats, fans, handkerchiefs, and suspicious eyes. On one side, the state of Louisiana, eager to defend the dignity of segregation. On the other, a man whose only crime was sitting where he wasn't wanted. The prosecution painted the picture quickly. The law was clear: separate facilities for white and colored passengers. Homer, being colored, defied that. End of story. The defense, led by attorney Albion Torgy, had a different take. Torgy stood tall, his voice calm but cutting. Mr. Plessy was denied the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. He was arrested not because he broke a law, but because he dared to challenge an unjust one. He paused. The state of Louisiana doesn't punish crime. It punishes audacity. Gasps filled the room. And then Torgy dropped the question that silenced the entire courtroom. If Mr. Plessy had been born lighter, with the same blood, the same body, the same soul, would he have been arrested? The silence spoke louder than any answer. But the judge, John Howard Ferguson, wasn't moved. He ruled against Plessy, declaring the state had the right to regulate rail cars within its own borders. The courtroom erupted not with noise, but with resignation. Everyone in that room knew this fight wasn't going to be won here. But the committee already had their eyes set on the next battlefield, the USS Supreme Court. As they exited the courthouse, reporters tried to swarm Homer. He said nothing, just kept walking. Later that night, at a small gathering back at the committee's meeting room, someone asked him, "Do you regret it?" Homer looked around the room, faces worn from fighting, eyes burning with quiet hope, and said simply, "No. I'd rather be arrested for sitting than live forever on my knees." The room fell silent. Then, slowly, they nodded. That night, they pored over legal briefs by candlelight, drafted appeals, strategized next steps. Because despite the broken plan, despite the bruises and betrayal, they knew something bigger had begun. The arrest had been real, the pain undeniable, but so was the resistance. And it was only getting louder. It was a warm October morning in New Orleans when Homer Plessy stepped into the courtroom. The heavy oak doors creaked open like a warning, and sunlight slanted across the polished floors as if reluctant to witness what was about to unfold. The room smelled like old paper and old prejudice. Rows of spectators whispered behind white gloves and lace fans. On the left sat local officials, city judges, and white businessmen, the kind who sipped coffee with sugar but couldn't bear to share a lunch counter. On the right, a scattering of colored men and women, dressed in their Sunday best, sat upright with quiet defiance. They didn't come expecting a victory. They came so history would remember they showed up. At the center of it all sat Judge John Howard Ferguson, a man of posture, not presence. His face betrayed nothing, but the law he stood for, that was already speaking volumes. Homer Plessy took his seat at the defense table. His attorney, Albion Torgy, placed a worn leather briefcase beside him and whispered, "No matter what happens in this room, we're not stopping here." Homer nodded once, no illusions, no fantasies of a fair shake, just a willingness to be the stone thrown into a very still pond. The prosecution went first. Their case was simple, almost smug. The Separate Car Act, passed in 1890 by the Louisiana legislature, required railway companies to provide equal but separate accommodations for white and colored passengers. Homer Plessy, a man of African ancestry, had knowingly violated that law by sitting in the whites' only car. The prosecutor gestured casually to the law book in front of him, as if pointing to scripture. "There is no ambiguity here," he said. "This man sat where the law says he could not sit. That is the only fact that matters. Simple, clean, convenient." But Torgy had come prepared to dismantle more than just legal jargon. He stood slowly, his hands steady, his voice measured but filled with a fire the room wasn't expecting. "What my learned colleague forgets," Torgy began, "is that this law, on its face, may appear equal, but in practice, it is anything but." He walked toward the jury box, slowly, purposefully. "We are not here to ask whether Homer Plessy boarded the wrong train car. We are here to ask why a government, sworn to protect its citizens equally, believes the color of a man's skin gives it the right to define his seat, his space, his worth." He turned toward the judge. Mr. Plessy paid the same fare, followed the same rules, caused no disruption, yet he was arrested not because of any action, but because of ancestry, because of lineage, because of a drop of blood the law cannot see, but insists on punishing. There was a murmur in the back. A woman clutched her Bible a little tighter. A man beside her nodded slowly. Torgy continued, "If a man who looks white is still condemned because of a distant African ancestor, then what hope does any colored citizen have? How many generations must pass before the law sees them as human beings?" Then came the moment the entire courtroom leaned in for. Torgy stepped closer to the bench and asked plainly, "Judge Ferguson, what race would Mr. Plessy be if the conductor hadn't asked?" The judge blinked, a subtle twitch at the corner of his eye. And that was the crack the fault line in the state's argument. If race could be invisible until inquired about, how could it be the foundation of law? But the silence didn't last long. Ferguson cleared his throat, leaned forward, and spoke with a finality that chilled the room. "This court is not tasked with redefining the law of the land," he said. "The Separate Car Act is clear. The legislature has spoken. The law is constitutional." And just like that, it was over. No deliberation, no reconsideration. Just another door slammed shut in the face of justice. Torgy didn't flinch. Neither did Homer, because they already knew this wasn't the fight, they were just sharpening the sword. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, pencils ready. A few white papers spun the story as a test of insolence by agitators trying to disturb Southern harmony. But the black press knew better. They saw it for what it was, a moment when America was forced to look at its reflection and chose to turn away. That evening, the committee met in silence. No champagne, no speeches. Just a single question from Maria Duff, spoken softly. Was it worth it? Homer looked up from his tea and answered without hesitation, yes, because now they have to say it out loud. What? That equality doesn't mean equal. The room sat with that truth like a bitter pill. Judge Ferguson's ruling would become the legal bedrock of racial segregation in America. But Albion Torgy had already drafted the appeal. The next stop, Washington, D.C., THEUSS Supreme Court. 9 men in black robes. One final chance to decide whether liberty was for everyone or only those whose skin passed the test. The train was still moving, but the tracks ahead would be darker, steeper, and far more dangerous. 4 years. That's how long it took for the case of Plessy via Ferguson to crawl its way from the heat-soaked courts of Louisiana to the marbled halls of the USS Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. 4 years of waiting, of planning, of hoping, and of watching segregation cement itself like rot into the woodwork of American life. By the time the case reached the highest court in the land in 1896, the Separate Car Act was no longer a Southern curiosity. It had become a blueprint. Across the country, states were watching, waiting to see if the Constitution would bend to the will of white supremacy or stand firm in defense of the promises it made after the Civil War. Homer Plessy wasn't in the courtroom that day. His role had been played. His arrest, his trial, it was all part of the script. But the final act no longer belonged to him. It belonged to 9 men in black robes. The chamber was solemn, towering, almost theatrical in its grandeur. Corinthian columns reached high above the gallery. Marble walls reflected the light like ghosts of justice past. Albion Torgy stood alone before the bench. In the months leading up to this moment, he had poured everything he had into the brief, an argument not just of law, but of conscience. He made a bold choice, one many called dangerous. In his filings, he referred to Homer as 7/8 Caucasian, not to diminish his identity, but to highlight the absurdity of a law that criminalized a person whose black ancestry was practically invisible. If a man who looked white could still be forced into second-class citizenship, then the law wasn't protecting race. It was protecting the idea of race, a falsehood used as a weapon. Torgy stood tall. He reminded the court that the 13th and 14th Amendments were written not to preserve tradition, but to dismantle systems of oppression. He warned that allowing segregation under the guise of equality would become a poison, not just in the South, but across the nation. His words rang out in the chamber. Justice is pictured blind, and her daughter, the law, ought at least to be colorblind. For a moment, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, that logic might land. But the silence from the bench said otherwise. The months passed. Then came May 18, 1896. The opinion was written by Justice Henry Billings Brown, a man who believed the Constitution should reflect the customs of society, not challenge them. The court ruled 7-1 in favor of Ferguson. The doctrine of separate but equal was now the law of the land. Justice Brown's words were wrapped in cold civility, but underneath they carried the full weight of betrayal. Laws permitting, and even requiring, separation do not necessarily imply the inferiority of either race. It was a lie dressed as law, but not every justice agreed. There was one dissent, a lone voice in a room full of robes. Justice John Marshall Harlan, a former slaveholder turned civil rights defender. Harlan stood apart not just in vote, but in vision. His dissent was not soft. It did not hedge. It did not beg. It thundered, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." And then, this, the thin disguise of equal accommodations, will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong this day done. He saw the future and feared it. He predicted that Plessy versus Ferguson would become a cornerstone of racial oppression, that it would be used to justify schools for black children with no books, hospitals with no doctors, buses with no dignity. He was right. Within weeks of the decision, newspapers across the South rejoiced. Legislatures fast-tracked new segregation laws. Separate waiting rooms. Separate water fountains. Separate cemeteries. States that had hesitated now moved with confidence, because the highest court in the land had handed them a weapon. And with one signature, America had legally divided its people, not just by race, but by worth. Back in New Orleans, the committee read the ruling in silence. One by one, they folded the newspapers and left the room. Some wept. Some didn't speak for days. Maria Duff sat with Homer in the back room of the office. Neither of them said much. But when she asked, quietly, "Was it all for nothing?" He shook his head. "No," he said. Now the world knows exactly what side the law is on. Outside, life carried on. Trains still ran. Schools still opened. Churches still rang their bells. But the rules were clearer now. If you were black or colored or native or not white enough, there was no more guessing. No more wondering. You had your seat, your entrance, your bathroom, your graveyard. The illusion of equality was gone. Now it was just the architecture of separation built brick by brick with the blessing of the Supreme Court. And as the ink dried on the decision, one truth remained painfully clear. It wasn't just a ruling. It was a permission slip signed by power, enforced by fear, and stamped with the silent complicity of a nation too comfortable to care. Justice that day wore a blindfold not to ensure fairness, but to avoid having to look at what it had done. The ink on the Plessy versus Ferguson decision had barely dried when America began redrawing its lines, not metaphorically, but physically. Overnight, new signs appeared like scars across the country. Whites only, colored entrance, no Mexicans, no Indians, no exceptions, separate waiting rooms, separate ticket counters, separate train cars, bathrooms, parks, elevators, cemeteries. It was as if the ruling had unlocked a door that white America had long been waiting to walk through, and now that it was open, they ran. In Mississippi, public libraries built new wings with fewer books for black readers, if they allowed them in at all. In Georgia, entire sections of public parks were fenced off. In Texas, Mexican Americans were told they could attend school, just not that school. But nowhere was the damage more intimate, more lasting than in the lives of children. 8-year-old Sarah Jefferson sat on the wooden steps of her schoolhouse in rural Alabama, her legs swinging just above the dirt. The school was one room, no insulation, a potbelly stove that barely worked, and a leaking roof that turned math lessons into wet guesses during the spring rains. Her textbooks were torn, their pages already used by white children 2 districts over. Sometimes the words were illegible beneath scribbles and racial slurs. Her teacher, Ms. S. Carter, taught 4 grade levels at once, with no chalk and only one map of Europe. Just 10 miles away, a white school stood like a palace. 2 stories, brick walls, polished floors. They had science labs and playgrounds, new books every year, a cafeteria that served hot meals. Sarah knew about that school because every morning her bus passed it on the way to her own. She didn't cry, not anymore. Not after Miss S. Carter told her, "We don't need marble floors to learn how to dream." But even at 8, Sarah understood what the adults wouldn't say out loud. Separate wasn't equal, and it never would be. In Oklahoma, the Kiowa Nation watched as white settlers flooded their lands, backed by government lotteries and shady legal tricks. Boarding schools for Native children spread like infection. Kids were taken, sometimes by force, stripped of their language, their braids cut, their names erased. Assimilation, they called it. But everyone knew what it really was: cultural genocide dressed up as Christian charity. In one such school, 12-year-old Wyatt sat on a stiff wooden bench, his face turned to the wall, silently mouthing the words of a prayer in English. He didn't understand. He missed his mother. He missed his language. He missed his name. The instructors told him, "You are American now." But he didn't feel American. He felt erased. In New Orleans, Homer Plessy kept a low profile. After the ruling, he quietly returned to his work as a shoemaker. The newspapers moved on. The committee disbanded. No parades, no protests. The Supreme Court had spoken, and the country listened. But Homer, he kept watching. He saw how quickly the country adapted to its new license to divide, how fast the laws multiplied, how easily neighbors became strangers, schools became battlegrounds, and rights became privileges reserved for some, denied to others. In 1898, Louisiana passed a new constitution that effectively wiped out black voting rights through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Within a year, black voter registration dropped by nearly 95%, and the world watched. Because Plessy wasn't just an American moment, it became a model. In South Africa, apartheid leaders would later cite separate but equal as intellectual inspiration. In Nazi Germany, early legal frameworks for Jewish segregation borrowed language eerily similar to Jim Crow laws. A single ruling, a single phrase, a single lie, and yet that lie built an empire. Back in Alabama, Sarah Jefferson, now 16, applied for a teaching license. She had passed every exam, scored top of her class. But when she sat before the board for final approval, one man glanced at her papers, then said plainly, "You're a bright girl, but we can't have you teaching white children, and we sure as hell won't pay you the same." Her fingers curled around her dress. She looked at him steady-eyed and asked, "Then who gets to decide what I'm worth?" He didn't answer, because he didn't have to. By the 1910s, lynchings became more common than court trials in many parts of the South. The Ku Klux Klan rose again like a ghost resurrected by law. Separate but equal gave cover to violence because, if the law already said you were less, why bother with proof? In too many cases, a whisper from a white woman could lead to a rope. And justice? Justice learned how to look away. And yet, people still resisted. Parents like Sarah's sent their kids to school with heads held high. Families like Wya's found ways to pass down language in secret. Church basements became classrooms. Barbershops became meeting halls. One-room schools with no heat produced doctors, lawyers, poets, visionaries, because even in a world divided, hope refused to be. But the divide? It was everywhere. In maps, in language, in policy, in the very architecture of American life. Plessy via Ferguson hadn't just drawn a line, it made that line real, enforceable, defensible. It wrapped discrimination in the cloak of legality and dared the world to challenge it. Few did. Most simply adjusted. But the anger, it was growing, quiet at first, then louder. A murmur that would become a voice that would become a movement. Because America had split the world in two. But the lie at its core, that separation could ever be equal, was beginning to unravel. He sat alone, not in the physical sense. There were 8 other justices in the chamber that day, but in every way that mattered. Justice John Marshall Harlan stood by himself. When the Supreme Court ruled 7-1 in Plessy via Ferguson, it wasn't just a legal defeat. It was a national turning point, a betrayal disguised as jurisprudence. But buried within the sea of agreement was a single dissent, one that refused to let silence speak for history. Justice Harlan's words didn't echo across the country that day, but they would, just not yet. Born into a slaveholding family in Kentucky, Harlan wasn't the obvious champion for civil rights. For much of his early life, he defended the institution of slavery, argued for state sovereignty, and upheld the very structure that had kept people like Homer Plessy off train cars and out of voting booths. But something changed. Some say it was the Civil War. Others point to his experience witnessing Reconstruction. Perhaps it was the hypocrisy he could no longer stomach. Maybe it was the realization that the Constitution meant nothing if it meant different things to different people. Whatever the cause, by the time he took his seat on the Supreme Court, Harlan was no longer the man he had once been. He had become something else. A contradiction, a convert, a man with a pen sharp enough to cut through centuries. In his legendary dissent in Plessy versus v. Ferguson, Harlan wrote not with the sterile detachment of a legal technician, but with the righteous fire of a man who saw the cliff the nation was sprinting toward and screamed for it to stop. "Our Constitution is color-blind," he began, "and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." It was a revolutionary statement in 1896, borderline heretical to the political class. But Harlan didn't flinch. He dismantled the idea of separate but equal with surgical precision. He called it a badge of servitude, a legal lie designed to humiliate and diminish black citizens while pretending to uphold fairness. And then he wrote the line that would haunt America for decades to come: "The thin disguise of equal accommodations will not mislead anyone nor atone for the wrong this day done. He predicted exactly what would happen, that this ruling would open the door to sweeping discrimination, that states would weaponize the decision, that the phrase separate but equal would become the most dangerous oxymoron in American legal history. And he was right. The other justices didn't respond to his dissent. They didn't need to. They had the majority. They had the moment. They had the power. But Harlan had the truth. And truth, though often late, tends to arrive precisely when it must. For the next several decades, as Jim Crow laws metastasized across the South, as lynching stained the earth, as children were turned away from schools, and soldiers came home from war to second-class citizenship, Harlan's dissent sat quietly in law books. It was rarely quoted, rarely taught, but in basements and black churches, in barbershops and classrooms, in whispered conversations and bold speeches it lived, because people knew, they could feel it. Somewhere, someone in power had seen the lie and had said no, even if that no came alone. By the 1940s, a new generation of black lawyers had taken note. Men like Charles Hamilton Houston and his protege Thurgood Marshall read Harlan's words not as a footnote but as a torch. Marshall would later say, "It was the only part of Plessy worth remembering." They began to build cases, one by one, chipping away at the idea that segregation was lawful, moral, or even functional. And every time they went to court, they brought Harlan with them, not in person, but in principle. They quoted him, cited him, framed arguments in his language. He became their ghost witness, their constitutional conscience. In 1954, 58 years after Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation in public schools was inherently unequal. The vote, 9-0, unanimous. And at the center of that decision, woven into the logic, was Harlan's long-forgotten dissent. The court didn't explicitly mention him. They didn't have to. His words were there in every paragraph, in every conclusion, in the very soul of the ruling. The voice that once stood alone had become a chorus. But for John Marshall Harlan, there were no celebrations. He had died in 1911, long before his dissent found redemption. He never got to see his words spark a revolution, never watched Thurgood Marshall argue in front of the bench he once occupied, never witnessed black children walk into schools that once shut their doors. But history rarely rewards its prophets in real time. And perhaps that's the point. The value of a lone voice isn't always in how loud it echoes today, but in how deeply it's remembered tomorrow. In New Orleans, an aging Homer Plessy sat on his porch, reading the headlines from Washington. He was old now, quiet, a shoemaker once again. But when he read the news of the Brown decision, when he saw the word unconstitutional attached to the system that had once jailed him, he folded the newspaper, leaned back, and whispered. They finally heard him. Maria Duff, still organizing voter drives and teaching young girls history, would later tell her students, never underestimate a voice, especially the lonely ones. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions start with a single person saying, "This is wrong," even if no one else says it with them. Yet, they had lost. Legally, publicly, undeniably, Plessy versus Bull. Ferguson was a defeat. The ruling etched in marble what millions already lived every day. A country split by skin, protected by law, and justified by silence. But there's something strange about truth. You can bury it, you can dismiss it, but you cannot kill it. Because the real story of Plessy versus Dane, Ferguson didn't end with a gavel. It began there. In 1955, 59 years after the ruling, a woman boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her name was Rosa Parks. She wasn't loud. She wasn't confrontational. She was tired, not just from a long day's work, but from a lifetime of being told where to sit, where to eat, where to exist. So when the driver barked, "Move to the back," she stayed where she was. That act, simple, quiet, deliberate, sent shockwaves through a nation that had grown too comfortable with injustice. And when Rosa Parks was arrested, she didn't just face local law enforcement. She faced the legal legacy of Plessy. The law that had once kicked Homer Plessy off a train now tried to push Rosa Parks off a bus. But something had changed since 1896. This time, The people were ready. Across Montgomery, a new voice emerged, a young pastor named Martin Luther King, Jr., with steady conviction and the cadence of prophecy. He reminded the nation that segregation wasn't just a policy, it was a moral failing, a scar on the soul of America. King knew the law was not on their side, but history might be. In speeches, he invoked Homer Plessy's name not just as a man who had been arrested, but as the first stone in a much larger foundation. Justice too long delayed, he said, is justice denied. But make no mistake, justice denied once is not justice denied forever. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. It cost the transit system thousands. It galvanized thousands more. And it was just the beginning. In courtrooms across the country, a quiet war was being fought, not with fists, but with briefs and arguments and precedent. Black lawyers, many of them trained at Howard University, where Plessy had been dissected like sacred text, mounted case after case, each one chipping away at the pillars of segregation. At the center of it all stood Thurgood Marshall, a man whose legal brilliance was matched only by his unwavering belief that the Constitution could be made honest if forced to confront itself. Marshall and his team targeted education first. They understood what many missed: segregation wasn't just about space. It was about value, about telling children from the moment they could read that they were worth less. So they took on schools. And in 1954, they won. Brown v. Board of Education was a direct confrontation of Plessy, and didn't flinch. The Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal in public education was inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. It was the first time the court officially admitted, we were wrong. They didn't name Homer Plessy, but his shadow was there, in the courtroom, in the arguments, in the victory. And so was John Marshall Harlan's dissent, resurrected after 58 years in legal exile, now standing tall at the heart of the new ruling, a voice once ignored, now echoed as law. But Brown wasn't the end either. If anything, it opened another front. States resisted. Schools closed rather than integrate. White citizens' councils popped up like weeds. The South dug in, determined to defend the old lines. And yet, the people kept moving. There were sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom rides through hostile towns, marches across bridges lined with state troopers. Each act of defiance carried the DNA of Plessy via Ferguson, not the defeat, the courage, the willingness to be seen, to be arrested, to be broken but never erased. Because every boycotter, every marcher, every mother walking her child into a newly integrated school was doing what Homer had done: sit down in a place they said you didn't belong and refuse to move. In New Orleans, where it all began, change came slowly, but it came. In 2009, over a century after his arrest, the Louisiana Board of Pardons officially acknowledged that Homer Plessy should never have been convicted. The governor signed a posthumous pardon. It was symbolic, yes, but it mattered, because sometimes history needs to be rewritten, not to erase the past, but to own it, to say this was wrong. And now we say so out loud. At a small ceremony, members of Plessy's and Ferguson's families stood together, descendants of two men once on opposite sides of history, now united in remembering it. Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson shook hands. We can't undo what was done, Keith said, but we can tell the story right. And Phoebe, great-granddaughter of the judge who ruled against Homer, nodded. Justice doesn't expire, she said. It just waits. So no, Plessy via Ferguson wasn't a final chapter. It was a prologue, a warning, a wound, a spark. It birthed a movement that reshaped America, not by accident, but by resistance. From courtrooms to classrooms, from marches to monuments, from whispered prayers to thunderous speeches, the legacy of that single act of defiance now lived in millions. Because a man once got on a train and refused to get off. And though the law condemned him, history did not. It's easy to look back on Plessy via Ferguson and think of it as history, distant, settled, tucked away in the yellowed pages of a textbook or behind a museum glass case. Just a man on a train, just a court case, just a law long overturned. But that's the trap. Because Plessy was never just about a seat. It was about a system, a mindset, a mirror. And the more we look into it, the more we realize that mirror is still very much intact. Today, there are no signs that say whites only. No legal train cars split by race. No official laws mandating segregation. But the lines? The lines never left. They just got smarter. They moved into zip codes and funding formulas, into school district boundaries and police patrol maps, into courtroom biases and voter suppression tactics, into algorithms and traffic stops and standardized tests. America no longer calls it separate but equal. Now it calls it zoning, tradition, school choice, personal responsibility. But the outcomes? They're hauntingly familiar. Walk into almost any public school in America and look closely. In urban centers, you'll find schools that are 90% Black or Latino with underpaid teachers, outdated textbooks, and crumbling infrastructure. Just a few miles away, in wealthier, whiter suburbs, schools sparkle with new labs, college prep programs, and classroom tech. Technically, these students attend integrated schools. Technically, the law is colorblind. But reality still isn't. That's Plessy's shadow, still standing in the hallway, still deciding which classroom gets a smart board and which gets a leaking ceiling. In the justice system, the echoes are even louder. A Black man is 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white man for the same offense. Prosecutors are more likely to seek harsher sentences. Judges more likely to set higher bail. Juries more likely to convict. And let's not forget the public defenders overworked, under-resourced, sometimes juggling 300 cases at once. Separate courtrooms? No. But separate outcomes? Absolutely. And it doesn't stop there. Black and brown neighborhoods are policed more heavily. They're more likely to be labeled high crime, more likely to have militarized raids, more likely to see a knee where there should have been a conversation. That's Plessy too, not in black and white, but in blue and blood. Even housing, arguably one of the most powerful tools of equity, hasn't escaped the legacy. Redlining may be illegal now, but its scars remain. Home ownership rates for Black Americans are lower today than they were in 1968, the year the Fair Housing Act was passed. Wealth gaps have widened. Neighborhood segregation has increased in some areas. Access to clean air, safe parks, and basic grocery stores still correlates directly with race and zip code. And what about healthcare? Infant mortality rates for Black mothers are 3 times higher than white mothers. Black patients are less likely to receive pain medication, less likely to be offered advanced treatments, less likely to be heard. Once again, no official signs, no courtroom rulings, just systems running on autopilot fueled by centuries-old assumptions that Plessy helped codify. So what do we do with this truth? How do we hold it? How do we name it? It starts with remembering that Plessy v. Ferguson was never just a legal moment. It was a national decision. A decision to prioritize comfort over courage, order over justice, whiteness over humanity. And while that decision was overturned on paper in Brown v. Says, Board of Education, its psychological contract still lingers signed in silence, renewed in inaction. But if Plessy taught us anything, it's this. One act of resistance, however quiet, however small, can ignite a movement that reshapes a nation. Homer Plessy didn't yell. He didn't throw fists. He simply sat where he wasn't supposed to. And that simple act still ripples through time. The question now isn't whether we still live with the consequences of Plessy. We do. The question is, what seat are you sitting in today? And whose seat are you silently allowing to remain empty? Because every time a child of color is placed in an underfunded classroom, Plessy's case lives on. Every time a voter is turned away because of new ID laws, Plessy's case lives on. Every time a teenager is sentenced unfairly in a courtroom, where their skin is the loudest argument, Plessy's case lives on. But so does the resistance. In teachers who demand equity, in lawyers who challenge rigged systems, in students who walk out, in artists who tell the truth, in communities who remember, and in people, maybe even people like you who refuse to look away. So yes, Plessy via Ferguson was about a train, but it was also about America's reflection. And even now, over 125 years later, That reflection still asks us the same question. Are we brave enough to choose justice over comfort? Or will we keep sitting in silence while the train keeps moving? And if this story moved you, even just a little, drop number 1 in the comments to show you're someone who refuses to forget. Let's remind the algorithm and the world that voices like Homer Plessy still matter. Because the lesson here isn't just about the past, it's about what we allow to happen in the present. Injustice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it wears a suit, signs a paper, and calls itself law. But silence is never neutral. So speak up, even if you're the only one. Your comment might inspire someone else to dig deeper. Your voice might be the start of someone else's awakening. Hit like, subscribe, and remember, history repeats itself when we stop paying attention.